This week featured another extraordinary moment in American politics. Liz Cheney and her father, former Vice President Dick Cheney, long considered among the most conservative and partisan Republicans in the land, announced they are endorsing Kamala Harris for president. The former vice president was once vilified by Democrats, labeled as a real-life Darth Vader. But his statement endorsing Harris offered an especially harsh view of Donald Trump. In our nation's 248-year history, Dick Cheney wrote, there has never been an individual who is a greater threat to our republic than Donald Trump. He tried to steal the last election using lies and violence to keep himself in power after the voters had rejected him. He can never be trusted with power again. Of course, the Cheneys are not alone. Some of the most prominent Republican leaders of the last 2 decades have also declared Donald Trump unfit for office, including 2012 Republican presidential nominee Mitt Romney, members of the McCain family, the former Speaker of the House Paul Ryan, and Mike Pence, Donald Trump's own vice president. And overnight, we learned that former President George W. Bush will not be making any endorsement whatsoever. In other words, the only living former Republican president not named Trump is not supporting his party's presidential nominee. But despite all that, the vast majority of Republican voters continue to support Donald Trump. Our latest ABC News Ipsos poll found that 93% of likely Republican voters support Trump over Harris. That's almost exactly the share of Republicans who voted for Trump 4 years ago. Will that change? Can Kamala Harris win over Republicans looking for an alternative to Trump? Liz Cheney joins me now for her first television interview in months. Welcome to This Week.
Thank you. Great to be with you, John.
So, bottom line, why did you make this decision to support Harris, and why did you do it now?
Yeah, I've been voting for 40 years. My first vote I ever cast was for Ronald Reagan in 1984. I've never voted for a Democrat.
Wow.
It tells you, I think, the stakes in this election. Donald Trump presents a challenge and a threat fundamentally to the republic. We see it on a daily basis. Somebody who was willing to use violence in order to attempt to seize power, to stay in power. Someone who represents unrecoverable catastrophe, frankly, in my view. And we have to do everything possible to ensure that he doesn't, that he's not reelected. Given how close this race is, in my view, again, it's not enough. You have many Republicans out there who are saying, well, we're not going to vote for him, but we will write someone else in.
Right.
And I think that this time around, that's not enough. That it's important to actually cast a vote for Vice President Harris.
I want to get to that in a moment, but first, you've made it abundantly clear that you have had policy disagreements with Harris. You still have policy disagreements with Harris. But she has moderated her positions on a whole range of issues from where she was just a few years ago. Did those moderations and the efforts to present kind of a moderate face at the Democratic convention, did that make the decision to endorse her easier?
I have never viewed this as a policy election.
Right.
But I think that it's a very important point. If you look at Vice President Harris's speech, for example, at the Democratic convention, it is a speech that Ronald Reagan could have given. It's a speech that George Bush could have given. It's very much an embrace and an understanding of the exceptional nature of this great nation, a love of America. A recognition that America is a special place, a recognition that we all have to work together to ensure that. And you contrast that to ensure that we maintain it. You contrast that with what we hear from Donald Trump, again, on a daily basis, that America is a failing nation, that America is a laughingstock. The trash talking of the United States of America very much is part of the message that Donald Trump is pushing. And so at the end of the day, I think it's important for people to recognize he's not a conservative. The policies that we're seeing him put forward, including, again, on an almost daily basis, this notion of embracing global tariffs, that he's going to impose 100%, 200% tariffs. That is fundamentally an anti-conservative policy. It's also a policy that I point out to friends of mine who say, well, we're going to vote for him because of his economic conservatism, will choke off global trade, will likely lead us down the path that we've seen before, for example, in the 1930s, lead to, at that point, it was a depression. The important thing for people to remember about something like the tariffs that he's promising, including, in addition to the fact that it's disastrous policy, he can do it alone. He does not need Congress, if he were to be reelected, to impose those massive tariffs that will, in fact, kill the American economy and the global economy.
I mean, in fact, he did some of that when he was in the White House.
And he's promising
to go to a new level.
Right.
So, but before I leave Harris's policies, back in 2019, when she was running for the Democratic nomination, she took a range of positions. Medicare for all. She suggested she would favor abolishing ICE, decriminalizing illegal border crossings, a whole range of issues that she has now, apparently changed. Would you still have been able to endorse Kamala Harris if it was the Kamala Harris of 2019 and 2020?
Look, I think that she has changed in a number of very important ways on issues that matter, and I would encourage independents to look at where she is on these policy issues today. I would encourage independents to compare where she is today with where Donald Trump is on these issues. And so I think from a policy perspective, it is very important to recognize the change, to recognize that she understands that this election is going to require a coalition of people from across the political spectrum supporting her. And that also necessitates an understanding that you've got to govern for all of those people. And on top of all of that, the Republicans have nominated somebody who is depraved, somebody who shows us every day that he has tendencies and he's willing to embrace things that are fundamentally a danger to this nation and to our Constitution. So the choice, in my view, is not a close one.
But have you spoken to Harris in
I
the
have.
process of making this? And can you tell us anything about that conversation?
I'm not going to talk about the details of the conversation, except I would just say that she has a full recognition and understanding of the stakes of this race and of the importance of reflecting the broad coalition that's coming together to support her.
And voting for her to stop Trump, which you made it very clear is primary motivation here, is one thing. What kind of president do you think she would be?
Look, I think, she has shown us, and you can watch, again, through the convention, you can watch in terms of the lessons that she's learned as vice president. Listen to her talk about her vision for this country, her vision for the future. I mean, we've been talking about economic policy. You look at national security policy, and again, there are certainly areas where I disagree with Biden administration national security policy, where I've disagreed with Vice President Harris's position on issues. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to fundamental alliances, when it comes to the importance of NATO, for example, and how important it is for the United States to lead in the world, we've seen a sea change. We now have a Republican Party that is embracing isolationism, that is embracing Putin, that, we've seen just in the last week, the Republican vice presidential nominee willing to appear, willing to be interviewed by Tucker Carlson, who is platforming pro-Nazis, is himself pushing pro-Nazi propaganda. That is not the party of Ronald Reagan. And I believe strongly that if you're talking about a national security set of issues and you care about America's leadership role in the world, a vote for Vice President Harris is the right vote to make this time around.
It is an extraordinary reordering of the whole political system when it comes to national security. Who would Ronald Reagan be supporting in this race? What do you think?
There is absolutely no chance that Ronald Reagan would be supporting Donald Trump. Donald Trump doesn't stand for any of the things that Ronald Reagan did. And it's another place where I would urge my Republican colleagues, both in the Congress but across the country, to really look at Donald Trump's policies, to really look at the danger that he presents, to look at what he was willing to do to stay in power. It's a firm rejection, not just of traditional Republican policies, but of the constitutional order on which this country depends.
So what do you say to those Republicans, and there are a lot of them, who are absolutely adamant they're not supporting Donald Trump, but they're not taking the next step? they're going to write somebody in. And we've heard this from Mitt Romney. We've heard it from Mike Pence. We've heard it from Larry Hogan. We've heard it from a lot of Republicans that are certainly anti-Trump. Why are they wrong in not taking the extra step?
Well, I would say, given the closeness of this election, particularly if you're going to find yourself voting in a swing state, you've got to take the extra step. If you really do recognize the threat that Donald Trump poses, then it's not enough to simply say, I'm not going to vote for him. I would also remind them, you know what, it's a secret ballot. So I would prefer to have as many people as possible out publicly making the case, but at the end of the day, you just have to wrestle with your own conscience when you're there in the voting booth. And I would expect that you will see far more Republicans and independents, when the time comes and they've got to make that decision, make the right decision.
There were a lot of talk during the primaries of the Nikki Haley voters, and some states seemed like even when she stopped running, almost a third of Republican voters were looking for an alternative to Trump and voting for Nikki Haley. She's now saying that she is, quote, on standby to campaign for Donald Trump to help him get reelected. She's also, of course, called him unhinged, unqualified to be president, diminished. What do you make of Nikki Haley's position on that?
I mean, look, I can't understand her position on this in any kind of a principled way. I think that, the things that she said, that she made clear when she was running in the primary, those things are true. And again, those of us who are conservative, those of us who believe in fidelity to the Constitution, have a responsibility and have a duty to recognize this is not about partisan politics. And the country is going to need to rebuild true conservative movement when we're through this election cycle. But this November, casting a vote for Donald Trump or writing someone in means that you've made the decision in too many instances that so many elected Republicans have made, which is to abandon the Constitution, to tell yourself that this is just simply, a partisan choice. That's not what we're facing this time around.
By the way, are you still a Republican?
I'm a conservative.
Have you left the party? I mean, I remember you, because we spoke about this a while ago, and you said if Trump were the nominee, you would not consider yourself a Republican.
I'm certainly not a Trump Republican. I am a conservative. I think that what's happened to the Republican Party today, is indefensible, and I hope to be able to rebuild, as I said, after this cycle. But I also think it's really important for us, as we're thinking about rebuilding, as we're thinking about the future of the country, to recognize that at the end of the day, the vast majority of people in this country want to know fundamentally that their elected officials are going to defend the peaceful transfer of power, and that they are going to put the Constitution first. And as someone who's been a lifelong Republican, it's heartbreaking to me to see what has happened to so many of the elected officials in my party, and I know we can do better.
Trump has obviously made retribution a theme of his campaign, and he's talked about prosecuting you. He's done it a lot. I mean, he did it just again after you endorsed Kamala Harris. Are you worried about what will happen specifically to you if he gets elected president again?
I don't think about it in those terms. I think about it in terms of what's going to happen to our country. It's not personal from my perspective, with one exception, and that is that I'm a mother. I'm the mother of 5 kids. And it is personal to me that my children grow up in a country where they know they can depend on the peaceful transfer of power, that they grow up in a country where their elected officials put fidelity to the Constitution first. That's how it's personal to me. It's personal to me when I listen to, fellow Republicans in the past say things to me like, well, it's fine, there are guardrails, he can't do that much damage. It's just simply not true.
On those guardrails, we had the Supreme Court has now issued its immunity decision declaring essentially that a president has immunity for anything that president may do, virtually anything that can be in any way defined as an official act. How does that immunity decision by the Supreme Court What does it mean to the possibility of a second Trump administration?
Well, it obviously makes the danger even greater. But when you look at what Donald Trump would be able to do with the levers of power, the extent to which he's already said he will not abide by the rulings of the courts. You know, our courts can't enforce their own rulings. If a president won't abide by the rulings of the courts, the rule of law disintegrates immediately. He's made clear that he will, for example, pardon the January 6th rioters. And if you think about, you know, the Republican Party, this is another point where they're presenting themselves now as a party of law and order. You know, Donald Trump sat for hours and watched people in his name brutalize the police officers, law enforcement at the United States Capitol. He sat for hours and watched on television and ignored the pleas of his family and others saying, you have to tell the mob to go home. So this is not a president who believes in the rule of law. This is a president who will use violence to achieve his own ends. And I think that the potential of the damage that he could do were he elected again is significant. It's also important to remember, on January 6th, the person who perhaps played the single most important role, in addition to the law enforcement officers who physically fought, was Vice President Pence, because he refused to do what Donald Trump was telling him to do, illegally and unconstitutionally throw out votes. J.D. Vance, who Donald Trump has picked to be his vice presidential running mate, has said specifically that he would, in fact, do that he would put Donald Trump's orders and instructions ahead of the Constitution. And it is hard to imagine a much graver danger than a president and a vice president who will put themselves above the Constitution.
Do you think he'll ever be held accountable for what happened on January 6th?
I think, number one, it is up to us, the voters, to hold him accountable in November, not to reelect someone who did what he did. Number two, I think that people need to look at what he argues and what his lawyers are arguing in court in the January 6th case in particular, which is, you know, trying at every moment to suppress that evidence. The Select Committee put on a significant amount of evidence available publicly,
thousands and thousands of pages of transcripts and documents.
Donald Trump has had for years now, and the special counsel has come up with even more, developed even additional evidence, testimony in front of the grand jury by those who are the most senior leaders. The American people deserve to hear that evidence, and Donald Trump is doing everything he can to prevent it because he knows what those senior officials said. He's seen the evidence, the testimony. American people deserve to see it. But ultimately, we have to hold him responsible and accountable, and we have to make sure that he's never in a position of power again.
All right, Liz Cheney, thank you very much for joining us live here on This Week.
Great to be with you, John. Thank you.